Welcome back to another Sundercore devlog. Over the past month, I've been hard at work making new status effects, as well as some UI changes and an overhaul to the level editor. If you're new around here, Sundercore is an action roguelike I'm developing in Gamemaker Studio. The jetpack mechanic is used to traverse the terrain and avoid enemy attacks, kinda like my game's version of a dodge roll or dash. This month I worked hard on making new status effects the player can inflict on enemies. I wanted a wide range of effects the player could get from passive items, many of which are ones you see often in games from the genre, and also some you don't see too often. Anyway, on to the first status effect. Poison inflicts damage to the enemy at set intervals. If you think of the game as having 60 ticks per second, poison damage occurs every 50 ticks the enemy is poisoned. So if the enemy is poisoned for 5 seconds for 1 poison damage, then the total damage will be 6 damage. Keep in mind that the poison damage and duration can vary depending on the player's collection of different artifacts. Artifacts are my game's version of passive items. One of the main ways the player can inflict these status effects is through a bullet modifier artifact. So these are items that influence the player's gun projectiles and give each bullet a chance to inflict that status effect. Inflicting frost will freeze up and slow down enemy movements and attacks. Each time an enemy is hit with a frost projectile, compounds with the frost already inflicted upon the enemy. So the more frost on an enemy, the slower and more affected they are. For game balancing purposes, enemies possess unique resistances to each status effect. Some might be more susceptible to frost, while others might resist it entirely. I hope this makes for some interesting choices the player has to make. Confusion works similar to the charmed effect seen in other games from the genre. When an enemy is afflicted with confusion, it will either wander aimlessly around the room or actively seek out and attack nearby enemies. Because of the way I programmed the enemy logic, all I had to do was change the target object from the player to the nearest enemy. So this was actually relatively easy to implement. Bleed functions similar to poison, albeit with a shorter duration of effect and a higher likelihood of being inflicted through projectiles. Bleed is generally less resistant than poison, making it more effective against a bigger range of enemies. The weak status effect imposes both higher damage susceptibility and reduced damage output on the inflicted enemy. This double-edged debuff not only amplifies incoming damage, but also reduces the enemy's offensive damage. I've seen the weak status effect in other games, but I don't exactly know how they handle it, so this is my take on the weak status effect. Permafrost is an upgrade to the frost status effect. Enemies hit with permafrost will instantly freeze into a block of ice that will slowly thaw until the enemy breaks out. Thawed enemies have max frost inflicted. I had a lot of fun making this effect, and it was definitely a challenge to make an ice block shape that I think can be overlaid on a variety of enemy sizes, but yeah, I think it turned out good. Inflicting fear will frighten the enemy for a short period of time, causing it to run directly away from the player. This can be used to create breathing room when surrounded by enemies, or to manipulate an enemy's path towards hazards or traps. This was actually inspired by the fear spell in Skyrim. If you're familiar with it, it essentially does the same thing. I don't think I ever actually used it, but it's an interesting effect, so that gave me the idea. Sleep is effective against most enemies. When inflicted, it causes the enemy to fall asleep temporarily. During this period, the enemy remains immobile and unable to attack. If attacked during sleep, the enemy will wake up and return to an alerted state. This is an effect that I don't think could work if it was inflicted by the player's gun projectiles, because most likely the enemy would be immediately hit with another projectile and woken up. So here I'm actually showcasing the sleep dart artifact. When the player reloads their gun, sleep darts will shoot out and inflict sleep on enemies when hit. The different item rarities influence how many sleep darts are shot out, with higher rarities inflicting both sleep and fear. So if the enemy gets woken up, they flee the player. The Crystallized status effect works the same as the Permafrost effect. The enemy is immobilized in crystal, unable to move or attack. After a short period, the enemy will break out of the crystal, disorientated and confused. Unlike Permafrost, enemies lack resistance to the Crystallized effect, meaning it's effective against all enemies. So it's kind of like the evolution of confusion as well as being similar to Permafrost. That about does it for the status effects. I have plans to make more, but the other thing you might have noticed during gameplay is the new UI. The UI has been shifted around a bit and redesigned in some areas. Most notably, the health bar is larger and the bomb icon has been removed in exchange for this new UI tab. This tab shows the inventory item currently selected. My idea for this is that the player has an inventory they can fill up with consumable items before they start the run, If they die, they lose all of it, and if they survive, they keep whatever's left. These consumable items will be things like bombs and maybe potions that grant limited time buffs to the player. The inventory is yet to be implemented, so I'll talk more on that in a later video when it's done. I've overhauled the level editor, so this is one of those things that's more of a benefit to me developing the game than anything else. I'm still not sure this will be in the final game. I feel like if it is, it will be a secret unlockable, unless I decide to highly polish it up and make it a main feature of the game. But for me right now, it's essential for making the rooms for the levels. The reason why I don't showcase that much variety in the rooms right now is because I still need to add more stuff to appear in the rooms. So whether it's just foliage or gameplay related, it's a lot of work to add those things to the level editor. So I'm holding back from making a ton of unique rooms because I'd only have to redo them later for the full game release. One of the new things I've added recently is the spike traps. There's a camouflaged variant and a variant that can be activated with a switch. The camouflage spikes are meant to punish new players. They do become more obvious once they've been activated, and generally you won't have to worry about running into them because they aren't too common. The other variant can be activated with a switch. This means you can lure enemies onto them, shooting the switch to activate the spikes at the right time. This will also mean that the player will have to be mindful of stray bullets that might hit the switch and activate the trap while they're on it. The next trap I've added is a wall-mounted dart shooter. This can be activated with a pressure plate. Both the player and non-flying enemies can activate the pressure plate. I'm playing around with the idea of letting objects like crates activate the pressure plate. I think this could lead to some cool puzzle rooms. Let me know what other kind of traps I should add. I've got plans to make explosive barrels and a new status effect, but that's for future development and future videos, so I'll see you next time.